Hey, my name is Luke Mullen. I'm an actor and environmental activist. I'm happy to join Earth Day 2024 virtual stage for a conversation with Leslie Ann St. Amour from Raven Trust, the campaign's director. So, Leslie Ann, can you introduce us to Raven and tell us a little bit about your work that you do and the problem that your group is currently trying to solve?
Absolutely. So we are based in Canada and we work with Indigenous communities here in Canada to protect their territories and their rights. And the communities we're working with are doing this through the legal system. They are going to court. And in protecting their territories and their rights, we're often also protecting really important things to the rest of the world as well. We're doing things like stopping projects that continue to emit um, high levels of toxins when looking at mining projects, or we're looking at projects that are emitting greenhouse gases, and we're looking at cases involving the spills of oil along the coast. And so, by doing this work and supporting these nations and protecting their lands and territories, we're also protecting the land and the earth for Canadians and folks across the world.
Yeah, no, and that's incredible. I feel like there's definitely a lot of environmental groups out there that protect land, they fight against the fossil fuel industry. But could you talk a bit about why it specifically needs to be Indigenous people who are at the forefront of the environmental justice movement and this integral role in the fight against climate change?
Absolutely. First off, Indigenous people are some of the people who are going to be most affected by climate change and are already seeing some of these huge impacts in their day-to-day life. One of the nations we work with, the Wet'suwet'en, are in the northwest of BC, and they're already seeing daily huge changes to their way of life and what they can do. This past winter in particular, we got not a lot of snow in BC, and they can see the impacts it's going to have on the thaw and the salmon run. And these are nations that rely a lot on the salmon, not only as a food source, but culturally and as an opportunity to pass down knowledge and cultural practices to their children and youth. And so by including Indigenous folks, we're also allowing folks who are already seeing these impacts in a day-to-day way that folks in urban centers aren't always to take that lead. As well, in Canada, Indigenous folks do have certain rights that are enshrined in law that let us use the law as a tool to engage in some of this protection in a way that other folks couldn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a big part of what you said is these fossil fuel projects, they happen in these localized areas that has these more immediate effects on indigenous communities. Uh, but obviously, the fossil fuel projects have global implications as well. So, a follow-up question to that is how does Raven Trust balance that focus between local indigenous struggles and sort of the broader global fight against fossil fuels?
A really great question because that's a lot of what my job is.
Awesome.
I'm a I'm a lawyer by training, and so I spend a lot of time taking the legal battles that are happening in these specific areas relating to specific projects and translating them into something that everyone can understand and everyone can understand why we're engaging in that battle in that specific area. One of our campaigns, we work with a nation called the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, and they're in northern Alberta near where the uh, oil sands are. And it came out earlier this year that the estimates for emissions coming from that area were 6,300% less than what is accurate. And so I can
Wow.
see you doing that math in your head. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, wait. That
Yeah.
yeah, that's
And
geez.
and it's because we have really local communities doing this advocacy work and trying to hold these companies to account because they see the immediate impacts that we can then take that and share that with the wider world who are also going to be impacted by this work, but might just not be seeing it yet. And I
Wow.
think that's how we balance that. It's a lot of taking the knowledge and the experience and sharing it to those who aren't seeing it yet.
So I know that Raven specifically does legal work. So I do have a follow-up question to what you just said, but I do want to talk about a little bit about the process of passing these laws that, I know that whole pipelines, shut down mines, protect indigenous land, and so what is the actual steps that you guys have to go through to pass these laws, specifically in Canada, right? Not,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
okay,
So what Raven does is we work with nations who will hire their own legal counsel and start a claim in courts. And we take on the role of fundraising for them because these cases are incredibly expensive,
yeah,
um, multi-million dollar cases, sometimes taking over. We have one file, the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, that they started their legal case in 2008, and they're scheduled to go to trial in 2026. And
yeah,
so,
just
yeah. And so
ridiculous.
the required experts, the lawyer time, even just the researchers, the travel for these folks who often live in remote areas and are traveling to courts other places, it adds up. And so we work to make this legal process accessible by fundraising and by telling their stories to the world at large, and by supporting advocacy that can go along with their legal challenges. And once they start their legal challenge, typically it's a few years, they'll go to trial, hopefully. We have several cases where their trial judgments are being appealed, either by them if they were unsuccessful, or by Canada or the province if they were successful. So we might have to go through an appeal process. We have had cases go all the way to Canada's Supreme Court.
Well,
And
can you
it's a
can
lot of
you
time,
talk
it's a lot
about
of money.
one of those examples of it going to Supreme Court and what that
Sure.
fight was like?
So I'll turn again to Beaver Lake, because this is part of why their process has gone on so long.
Yeah,
Several years into their process, they realized they were not going to be able to afford to continue to do this. And the legal system in Canada has a tool that is supposed to help with that called an advanced costs order. And basically, what that means is that if it looks like you're going to be successful, you can apply to the court to order the opposing party to have to pay some of your costs now, with the assumption that it's essentially the costs you would have got back when you were successful at the end of the trial. They only do this in rare circumstances where you show you can't afford it otherwise, where it's in the public interest. It's a private dispute between two people. They're not going to do this, but where it has
sure.
public value. And Beaver Lake, as a First Nation, as a First Nations government, has obligations to their people. And so originally the courts looked at them and said, well, you have money. You're just choosing to spend it on housing and sending your children to school. Um,
Yeah,
and so,
non-essential things.
yeah. And so you don't need this advanced cost order. And they fought that from trial to appeal to the Supreme Court, setting a new precedent in Canada that actually, when you're looking at Indigenous governments, just because they have other money in the bank, if that money is earmarked for essentials like housing, education, that doesn't necessarily equate into the equation for can you afford this litigation. You're
Wow.
allowed to show that the money you have is designated for something crucial, and you can still need the advanced costs order. And so that was
Wow.
really incredible, and something that opened an avenue for other nations across the country to be able to access this legal tool.
That's incredible. Yeah, they literally changed federal law. That's, yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, I know that you guys specifically work in Canada. I just wanted to mention the Willow project that just happened in Alaska. The largest oil drilling project on federal land in history in the U.S. Despite the pleas of millions of young people and indigenous communities who live on the North Slope of Alaska. So when these legal pathways uh, maybe fail, what do we do next, and what do you do next? Because these projects are going to have consequences for generations of Indigenous people, uh, and so when this legal fight is over, what is the next step that Raven specifically will try to initiate?
One of the big things is that we look at the agreements we have with nations in this work that we do, not necessarily as a contract, but truly as a relationship. And so, even if the legal avenues have ended, we really do try to find ways to continue to support the nations we work with and continue to tell their stories. A good example is the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is scheduled to be built and put into effect in Vancouver.
Hmm.
We were involved in the legal battles, which were eventually unsuccessful in stopping that pipeline. But we still have a relationship with the nations that are still trying to stop that pipeline. And I recently got to participate in a panel at a film screening for a film called Warrior Spirit, which is all about the battle of one of the land protectors, Will George, who's
Hmm.
been involved in that work. And so we try to find ways to continue to support these folks. It is challenging for us as a charity. It limits some of what we can do, but we try
Yeah.
to find ways to continue to tell their stories and share their experiences with the wider world and use our connections with other nonprofits, grant makers to try to find them support where we can't.
Well, yeah, that's amazing. And I want to end it on sort of the broader call to action here for people who are inspired by your work, inspired by Raven. They want to support indigenous rights, and simultaneous environmental rights and protection. What actions can they take to be the most effective?
I think a big one is learning about Indigenous rights, learning about Indigenous sovereignty, understanding why this approach is, at least in my mind, the most effective. And actually often backed by the science as the most effective. Indigenous led conservation is often shown to be the most effective.
Yeah.
Um, Donate to Raven. I will have to put that pitch out there. It is a great option. We're also a
Yeah,
registered charity in the US. And also look to the local nations around you and see what they're fighting right now. And are there ways you can be supporting them? And are there ways that you can be lending your privilege and even your voice if you can't financially support to these causes and to these fights?
absolutely. Well, Leslie Ann, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been so insightful, and it inspires me to get more involved in this fight. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you
Luke.
for your work.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.